Shell-shock can take many forms, but it is a reaction to the helplessness felt by those in a war zone and can manifest in many different ways, including panic, violence, anger, or an inability to perform basic tasks like sleeping, walking, or talking. Now classed as a type of PTSD, the term has been retired in medical circles, but it is still understood to be specific to those who have been involved in active warfare and combat. Like many mental health disorders, humans have a poor history with how we've treated those with shell-shock. The term first arose during World War I, when it was published in an article written by psychologist Charles Myers for the British medical journal The Lancet, after seeing the effects of combat in the soldiers at his war hospital post. Although shell-shock was not a uniquely British disease, no other European country has conducted any surveys or analysis into its impact during the war, and it's been suggested the disease was not quite as epidemic elsewhere, although it certainly was still an issue. One of the causes of this could be the uniquely British culture and traditions of stiff upper lip and keep calm and carry on. Thanks to British stoicism, reactions to shell-shock were largely derisive and dismissive, with sufferers seen as psychologically weak or lacking in moral fibre. This is apparent in the words of a British general at the time. There can be no doubt that, other things being equal, the frequency of shell-shock in any unit is an index of its lack of discipline and loyalty. The condition was first noted by the British Expeditionary Force, who reported medical issues after combat such as tinnitus amnesia, tremors, dizziness, and a hypersensitivity to noise. In December 1914, at least 10% of wounded British soldiers were reported as suffering from shell-shock. By the end of the war in 1918, over 20,000 of those left alive suffered from the illness, and it was predicted there were over 80,000 sufferers during the war. Doctors were initially dumbfounded by the symptoms of shell-shock. To all intents and purposes, symptoms looked like they resulted from physical injury, with soldiers in the trenches going blind, deaf, mute, or becoming paralyzed. But doctors quickly realized that physical injuries weren't the cause when soldiers who had never seen the front line began reporting similar symptoms. They soon believed that while any man could become disturbed by their experiences, for it to continue for an extended period of time showed a lack of character. This is despite the fact that more and more cases were reported as the war went on. Officers were apparently particularly susceptible, as they were supposed to put on a brave face for their men, and as such, repressed their emotions even more than the average British man. No one saw this side effect of war coming, and soon hospitals overflowed with men suffering from shell-shock. The military had to take over private asylums and mental hospitals to provide beds for these additional, unexpected patients. In Britain, initially at least, sufferers were sent away from the front line to convalesce in hospitals. But as cases became more frequent and more men were diagnosed than the military could handle, responses became harsher and treatment for patients more brutal. It also varied wildly depending on officer, rank, unit, and doctor involved. One of the biggest and most shameful parts of the war was in our response to these soldiers, 306 of whom were shot for cowardice or desertion of post. We can't possibly imagine what these men were going through, and the lack of sympathy and understanding, to downright cruelty, remains one dark spot of many in British history. It wasn't until the 7th of November 2006 that they all received a posthumous pardon from the British government. And those who were lucky enough to be treated during World War I did not have a great time of it. Some received a day or two of bed rest, but more were shipped off to psychiatric hospitals to experience a variety of treatments. Medical officers were frantic and in desperate need of soldiers without physical injuries to return to the combat zone. They focused on quick and harsh cures such as isolation, forced deprivation of enjoyable activities, and exposure to their fears. For example, patients who feared loud noises were placed in rooms overlooking busy main roads. And worst of all was the extensive use of electroshock treatment, which even some doctors objected to, as they worried about the effects of prolonged exposure. Unsurprisingly, these treatments did not prove effective, and over 80% of patients never returned to the war. By 1917, the British Army actually banned the use of the term shell-shock, They claimed it was an inaccurate term and were apparently concerned of it being used as a get-out-of-war-free card. But more simply, they didn't want to admit the depths and extensive trauma that had impacted so many more soldiers than they ever predicted. One of the most disturbing reports, and a glimpse into how poorly shell-shock victims were treated, was published in 1918 by Louis Yealand, a British clinician that believed shell-shock was simply the result of a loss of manhood and should be seen as a personal failure. He claimed that all these men needed was to remember their bravado and heroism to become whole again. If you fancy seeing the thoughts of a truly cold and unsympathetic man, Yealand's paper Hysterical Disorders of Warfare is available to read for free online and is nothing short of horrifying. In it, he talks of his firm treatment methods on 7 patients, known only as A1 through 7. They included strapping one young man down to a chair for 20 minutes at a time, while applying strong electricity to his neck and throat, putting out cigarettes on his tongue, and applying hot plates to the back of his neck. Yealand also believed he had discovered the cure for shell-shock-induced mutism, and that the most effective treatment method was applying an electric shock to the patient's throat or thigh consistently and repeatedly until the patient could muster the word "ah." In the case of patient 1, he gleefully reports success that sounds more like torture to anyone sane, forcing the patient to stay awake during hours of shock therapy, walk around the room repeating vowels, disparaging and berating them as they did so, and refusing them water or any sort of release from his treatment until they managed to utter a cohesive and coherent sentence. Although horrific to modern eyes and ears, Yealand's methods and mentality were sadly not that different to many physicians of the time. When the war ended, soldiers continued to be treated for their injuries, physical and emotional. Shell shock does not end when war does. Even 10 years after, over 65,000 soldiers in Britain were still receiving treatment, and it's unknown how many were lost to suicide during those tragic years. How we treated these heroes of war was deeply wrong, and, sadly, understanding did not improve in the following years. Shell-shock victims continued to be demonized and looked down upon by the public, and many sufferers lived their lives in relative isolation, as pariahs of society. After the British Army completely banned the use of the term shell-shock, many others rose up to take its place, including combat neurosis, combat stress reaction, and post-concussional syndrome. Luckily, today, our understanding of psychiatric disorders has grown, and we now acknowledge that shell-shock sufferers were not cowards of wartime, but victims of it. How these men were treated is something that should remain in our national consciousness forever. Enjoyed this video? Don't forget to like and subscribe for more horrible or horribly interesting content.